Oh my gosh, and that wasn't on. Um, so
I'm gonna go fix the
Well, thank you
camera.
for appearing on Ancient Apocalypse as
My
well.
pleasure. My
okay,
pleasure.
wait a minute.
It's
I
a,
just
a
figured it out.
subject to me that is so
Sorry, if you're
unbelievably
here listening,
fascinating
give me a
and
minute.
so
I'm gonna. What are you
bizarre
doing?
that it's controversial.
Okay,
I
yeah.
do not understand. I mean, we were just talking about this, and I said, let's stop talking when we're getting coffee.
Yeah.
It's, to me, it seems like there's things that are concrete, right? We know when Genghis Khan lived.
Yeah.
We know when they built the 16th chapel. We know a lot about the Parthenon and the Acropolis. We know about 2,000 years ago. We know when you start going way, 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 way back, things get real sketchy. And to not admit that seems so crazy. When they find things, when they're making apartment buildings, sometimes they're digging into the ground. They go, "Oh, hold on a second, what is this?" Doesn't it happen in Mexico City all the time?
Yeah, it does. And actually, that's how a lot of archaeology happens. Somebody's building a road or building apartment buildings or building a dam, and they call in archaeologists to see if there's any interesting archaeology there. And this is part of the problem I have with archaeology as a discipline. It likes to think of itself as scientific, but what I think it's primarily doing, and it is weird, is trying to control the narrative about the past.
Do you think that's because the people that are in control of archaeology, the academics, the professors, these people have written books on these things, have lectured on these things, and they've been very specific about timelines and dates?
Yeah, I think it's a complicated it's a complicated mixture of things. First of all, because archaeology is so desperate to be seen as a science, it tries as hard as possible to distance itself from any ideas that might be seen as woo-woo. Anything out on the edge, archaeology doesn't want to associate itself with. And then it takes the next step and really seeks to attack out on the edge ideas. Now, I don't know why the possibility of a lost civilization during the Ice Age out the edge idea. We've had lost civilizations before. The Indus Valley civilization in today in Pakistan. Wasn't known about until the 1920s. It was found by accident.
watch this episode in a second. Okay, sorry. Is the feed clean? Well, you gotta put it on the thing. Click the menu button. This is the one that you just put this on. This is a. It's just not recording, but do you need the camera to record? It doesn't need to record. No. No, record here. I try to stop the thing, which would be 8 pounds. 8 pounds. What is the setting to turn off? Where? It was the audio only download. It's probably just in setting. Where's setting? I would imagine the 3 buttons at the top of the screen. Didn't I just click on that? I think you right clicked on that. Oh. I don't know. Maybe your profile picture. There should be a download.
Joe Rogan podcast. Check it out.
The Joe Rogan Experience.
Train by day, Joe Rogan podcast by night, all day.
Hello, Joe Rogan.
Good to see you, my friend.
Good to be back with you.
Hey, congratulations on the success of your show. It's been it's very awesome to see, and it's been really awesome to hear from so many people about it that know that I'm really fascinated by the subject. And the reviews have all been super positive for my friends, so I'm really excited about it.
Well, thank you for appearing on Ancient Apocalypse as
My
well.
pleasure. My pleasure. It's a subject to me that is so unbelievably fascinating and so bizarre that it's controversial. I do not understand. I mean, we were just talking about this, and I said, let's stop talking when we're getting coffee.
Yeah.
It's, to me, it seems like there's things that are concrete, right? We know when Genghis Khan lived.
Yeah.
We know when they built the 16th chapel. We know a lot about the Parthenon. We know about 2,000 years ago. We know you start going way back, things get real sketchy. And to not admit that seems so crazy. When they find things, when they're making apartment buildings, sometimes they're digging into the ground. They go, "Oh, hold on a second, what is this?" Doesn't it happen in Mexico City all the time?
Yeah, it does. And actually, that's how
3 hours
a lot of archaeology happens. Somebody's building a road, or building apartment buildings, or building a dam, and they call in archaeologists to see if there's any interesting archaeology there. And this is part of the problem I have with archaeology as a discipline. It likes to think of itself as scientific, but what I think it's primarily doing,
Frenchie, you can't hear me,
and it is weird, is trying to control the narrative about the past.
Do you think that's because the people that are in control of archaeology, the academics, the professors, these people have written books on these things, have lectured on these things, and they've been very specific about timelines and dates?
Yeah, I think it's a complicated it's a complicated mixture of things.
Okay.
First of all, because
be
archaeology is so desperate to be seen as a science.
Not well, but I hear you.
It
Okay.
tries as hard as possible to distance itself from any ideas.
Should I put my volume up, or our volume up, or should I put the volume of the podcast down?
Archaeology doesn't want to associate itself with, and then it takes the next step and really seeks to attack out on the edge ideas. Now, I don't know why the
and this is what archaeology does.
Civilization during the Ice Age should be an out on the edge idea. We've had lost civilizations before. The Indus Valley civilization today in Pakistan wasn't known about until the 1920s. It was found by accident.
Indus River Valley, and now it's a huge deal.
Can reveal new information, but
there's no reason to think we know everything right now.
The reaction to my proposal that we've forgotten an episode in the human story, it's always been hostile since I published Fingerprints of the Gods in 1995. But with Ancient Apocalypse, much bigger platform, reaching a much wider audience.
Well, there's no video. Yeah, it's okay.
And it went on.
There's no video on the Joe Rogan one.
And it appeared to me. I'm going to share some images. I don't think archaeologists are involved in a conspiracy. I think the people who are attacking me genuinely believe in what they're saying, and they genuinely think I'm harmful. But they do genuinely believe it, but it's because they've been socialized.
How did they come up with that? How is it harmful to be speculating about ancient structures? It's interesting.
Yeah.
And
that's what I don't get.
The other thing is the racist angle. Like, we're talking about the exact same people.
Yeah.
We're just talking about an older time. It doesn't make any sense at all. No. In fact, it kind of points to the superiority of the Egyptian race.
Absolutely.
I mean, whatever they did, however they did it, is unbelievably extraordinary.
Yeah.
And I think pointing that out is amazing.
Yeah. It challenges the status quo.
Discovering and what you're showing
status quo
on that
can't be
show
challenged.
is that there are a lot of mysteries when it comes to the history of human beings, and we should embrace those mysteries because there's concrete, irrefutable evidence, especially in terms of like Göbekli Tepe and some of the other structures.
Göbekli Tepe being
this is wild
recent,
stuff.
Massive
The
archaeological
idea that human beings
finds.
had an advanced civilization
last few years.
10,000, 20,000 years ago, 30,000 years ago.
Rewrote history.
What happened? That's what's really interesting.
Yeah.
Like, what happened?
And that's why it's Ancient Apocalypse, because we know that there was a global cataclysm, a slow one, 1,200 years long, between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago, called the Younger Dryas.
The Younger
There's
Dryas.
still arguments about what caused it,
Always
but the
talk
fact
about
that
it.
it was cataclysmic is not really not really.
So this is something that I want to point out. Like, there was this massive period of time. I don't know if you've heard of it. Younger Dryas, massive cataclysm, and it's brought into question this older idea that people still seem to think a lot about, that the cataclysms, as in like the everything that like people think that things are in, or there's a pervasive idea that things are in a constant state, but they're not. They are not in a constant state. Things change with cataclysms are more common. That's my point. Jeez, gosh, made it badly. Okay,
Disputed.
that's all right. We're
The
here figuring it out.
accusations that
What's
were
up,
put
boys?
against me and the show of being, the accusations included the words racist, white supremacist,
Ridiculous.
misogynist.
I wish he was.
And
I'm a
anti-Semitic.
misogynist.
They give you the full hand.
It's like no one who actually
give you
watched
one
it
The
card
show
out.
thinks that.
doesn't touch
No,
on
they
any
don't.
of these issues. Race is
I hope
not-
they bring
race
up
is not
Flint
mentioned
Dibble.
in the show.
If they bring
So
up
what
Flint
the
Dibble, Flint
archaeologists
Dibble
were
has
doing
me
there, they were going back
banned
to
on
Fingerprints of the
or
Gods that
blocked
I
on
wrote in
YouTube, by the
Who's
way.
Flint Dibble?
Flint,
in which I reported.
we'll see. We'll see if they bring him up.
indigenous
If not, I'll tell you.
traditions about the appearance
He's an
of
archaeologist
bearded foreigners
that agreed
bringing
and then backed
knowledge
out on a
after
debate.
a cataclysm to the shattered survivors of that cataclysm. And in some cases, in those traditions, those knowledge bringers are described as white-skinned. And that is,
Oh, yeah,
that is
bro,
why the
base.
show is accused of racism, because archaeology has since taken the view that all of those stories were made up by the Spanish. And that
Which is
seems to
ridiculous.
be completely ridiculous.
I've talked about this
Uh,
before.
both in-
So these stories of like white people being magic, coming on boats, they make total sense within everything that we understand about ancient peoples. I mean, even like almost modern Europeans, early modern Europeans, as well as medieval Europeans, ancient peoples everywhere. Like this is an idea. It's not that crazy that they thought that somebody came in as a god. They weren't monotheistic. So having a god, it's not like the god, it's just a god. And there's lots of gods and everything has mana. I mean, all these animist cultures believe that rocks have energy and power in them. So it's not that crazy that people that came in on giant boats that no one had ever seen anything like it before were gods. Is the video flickering, or is that my screen?
Mexico and in Peru and Bolivia, we have traditions. We have them, Viracocha, we have Quetzalcoatl, we have Bochica. This is a Pan-American myth. And actually,
brother.
I think it's racist of archaeology to imagine that the magic powers of the Spaniards could impose a myth upon indigenous peoples all over the Americas, that they'd just be so stupid that they would fall for this story told by the Spaniards. Of course, these are indigenous myths and traditions. And I was reporting them in that book, and I stand by them. And it turns out that there's actually a huge argument within academia about this, and my critics were just giving one side of that argument.
And what is the rest of the argument? What is the other side of it?
Well, the other side of the argument that it's inconceivable that the Spaniards made up these stories. These stories were reported to the first Spanish visitors in Mexico and in Peru. They were reported to them by indigenous peoples as indigenous myths, and the fact that they're right spread across the Americas
That seems to have
makes
fixed
it
it
very
somehow.
unlikely. I mean, if it was one story, but if it's a dozen stories and they're told over a huge geographical region, the notion that this is a Spanish conspiracy, it's an ultimate conspiracy theory. I don't think we should take away these traditions from the indigenous people who reported them, but it gave a very useful handle for people to attack this series on.
So the theory is that it was an uneven destruction, right? And that some places fared better than other places in terms of the Younger Dryas impact theory, right?
Yeah.
And that those people might have reclaimed a modicum of civilization.
Yeah, that's the idea.
just did
And
it
by
on
the
there.
way, on
I
that
know,
point,
but it's not doing it on here. So
I have never, in anything that I've written or anything that I've broadcast, ever myself
ATEM okay?
suggested that white races were involved. Actually, it would be quite stupid to do so, because if you look at Europe, during the Ice Age, and I'm talking about a lost civilization of the Ice Age, Northern Europe and North America were absolutely inhospitable wildernesses during the Ice Age. They were frozen, they were dry, and they were dangerous. And they were not the places that people would go. People naturally gravitated south towards the equator, towards the tropics. That's where I would expect to find traces of a lost civilization. And that's where I do find traces of a lost civilization. You
in
don't
these
really
places,
I've never reported anything about the UK, for example, in my books. We have Stonehenge, we have Avebury, we have these stone circles, but they're not old enough.
You know,
that was the time when
maybe
the
it's
UK
Polynesians. That would make the most
warmer,
sense to me,
it's
right?
the same with the rest of
Freaking
Northern
Polynesians,
Europe,
man.
the same with the northern part of North America. You have to go down to the southern part of North America. You have to go into Mexico. You have to go into South America to really find an environment during the Ice Age that would have nurtured a high civilization.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of speculation as to why they weren't able to cross the Bering
And remember the
well, again,
the
this
level
is an
was
area
so much
where there
lower.
has
Oh my
been
gosh.
a narrative that archaeology has sought to impose upon us, and this was called the Clovis First idea. That there was a people.
And Clovis First is dead.
Clovis,
but this is what I was
don't
taught
know
in
what
high
they
school,
called themselves.
and I'm only 28.
In North America, and traces of their characteristic tools, particular sort of fluted points, arrowhead, spear points, turn up from about 13,400 years ago and end abruptly 12,800 years ago. And for a long time, with the beginning of the Younger Dryas, and for a long time, archaeology maintained that this Clovis culture, so-called Clovis culture, we don't know what they call themselves, were the first Americans, and that there were no human beings in the Americas before 13,400 years ago. And bit by bit, the new evidence has come in, which has forced archaeologists screaming and tearing out their hair to back away from the Clovis First paradigm and admit that actually, yes, there were people here before that. But even then, they're reluctant to go.
And it took them years.
We've recently had these,
and now it's like 21,000
in New Mexico.
Yep.
23,000 years.
23,000,
so.
whatever.
That's largely
21,000 BC, I guess.
But there are much earlier dates. There's 130,000 years ago from the Cerruti Mastodon site near San Diego.
That's the one that's being disputed because they say it could have been rocks that crushed the bones and made them that way.
Yeah, what I see again is an unfortunate mindset where a new and interesting idea is proposed, supported by masses of evidence and published in Nature. You know, Nature has a pretty high bar to what it accepts. And then the critics look for any way to get rid of it.
Can I stop you here? Are you aware of the Boneyard in Alaska?
I've heard of it, and it sounds fascinating. I don't think he's revealed much about that.
Well, it's an amazing discovery. This guy's a gold miner, and he has large piece of land in Alaska. They're mining for gold, and they start finding like tusks and bones. And in one area that's only a few acres, they found thousands and thousands of woolly mammoth bones and tusks and saber-toothed tiger. Was it saber-toothed tiger? No, it was short-faced bear. They found all these
all the megafauna,
many animals that weren't even supposed to exist in Alaska. And he's like, look, we have the bones of it.
Yeah.
And one of the things they found recently was bones that were sawed, clearly sawed.
Human workmanship.
But like a sophisticated tool. Let me see if you can pull it up so you can see how it looked.
Clearly cut. Clearly
Isn't that
sawed,
amazing?
Yeah, absolutely.
So they're trying to find out what the dates on these are.
That was my next question. Have they dated it?
They just got these recently. This is fairly recent. So I believe he's had some issues with universities.
I'll try one more thing. I'm sorry. I'm going to screw around with this a little bit. Bear with me, boys.
Off his stuff.
Giant Nephilim.
Yeah,
yes.
well,
I'm going to be talking to a guy very soon about
bone
stuff like that.
In the East River. Because it turns out that during the 1920s and 1930s, stuff that they had taken from his land before he owned it, they had dumped some of it because they had so much of it. They dumped it in the East River, and they were balking at it. But meanwhile, these people have found it there.
Yeah.
So here it goes. I think many of you are intrigued by these Ice Age bones found in the Boneyard in Alaska. If you zoom in, you'll see that it's been sanded or somehow been worked down to a smooth finish on the end. I'm going to carbon date one of them. I'll post the results when I do. So this is 3 weeks ago, so it's probably going to take a little longer. But look how smooth it is on that one bottom.
Perfectly cut, and we'll look forward to seeing the dating results. But the fact that we're dealing with megafauna, that went extinct between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago, implies very strongly that it's at least that old.
Not only that, his area has a very thick layer of carbon. That seems to indicate some sort of a mass burn or some sort of a horrible disaster. So they're going through these layers of things, and they're finding an unbelievable amount of animals that died in this area.
Yes,
Just a
Raven.
mass
It is Raven. I
die-out.
was just talking to him on
and what would cause a mass
Twitter.
die-out, not human hunting.
Right.
This is I'm strongly opposed to what they call the overkill hypothesis. This is one of the alternative explanations for why the megafauna went extinct at that time.
Right.
Is that hunter-gatherers literally wiped out all the megafauna, and to me that, for a couple of reasons, that doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense, first of all, because hunter-gatherers we know in the world today do not wipe out their prey animals. They live in coexistence with them. They live in balance with them.
Yes, this is true. And
it's
I
kind
need
of
to
culture
address
that
this.
destroys animals.
Right, like what we
completely.
did with the bison.
What we did with the bison.
Yeah.
And therefore it seems very...
Yes, it is true that in general, hunter-gatherers today do not really kill a lot of populations of like they live in harmony with animals. Yes, that all that is true. We should I just want it to be known that we should be careful when we're talking about what hunter-gatherers did in the past versus what they do today, because hunter-gatherers today are living in a world where they've been contacted for many years. And that creates a very different situation than hunter-gatherers who are living around other hunter-gatherers as well as around other people. You know, there's selection of like some people can choose to leave the village. They use different technology in the village. They're exposed to different things. So hunter-gatherers in the past and hunter-gatherers of today should not be assumed to be a one-to-one, essentially, is what I'm saying. You know, they can still be, you know, they can still be cool. They can still... whatever. Yeah, we're gonna keep going. But yeah, that's the thing. And then but really it is true that they don't look at me like that, Higgy. It is true that they did
hunter-gatherer like activity to
that many hunter-gatherers do that.
The megafauna. And the other thing is the simultaneous extinction of large numbers of creatures that is happening very, very, very quickly suggests to me that we're looking at a disaster of some sort. And that's why the Younger Dryas impact
hypothesis, and it used to be,
which is solid science.
People used to think that it was Clovis.
Disputed,
it was people coming to North America, but
disintegrating
people have been here a lot longer.
Hit the Earth 12,800 years ago. Many of them didn't hit the Earth. Many of them exploded in the sky. They were not that big, maybe 100 meters in diameter. So they were air bursts, but they leave these characteristic signatures in the ground. And
like Tunguska.
Exactly like Tunguska. The Tunguska event is a recent example of that. 30th of June, 1908, happens to be at the peak of the Beta Taurids, and the Taurid meteor stream is identified as the likely culprit for what happened in the Younger Dryas. Wildfires burning, you get these impacts smashing into the Earth, bursting in the air over forests. They cause huge fires and that's why you get enormous amounts of charcoal as a result. And then the larger objects, it's thought, hit the North American ice cap and caused a very large amount of meltwater to flow into the world ocean, and that's what brought temperatures down at the beginning of the Younger Dryas. We can argue there are alternative theories. Maybe solar activity was involved. Robert Schoch prefers a change in solar activity, and you know, kudos to Robert. He's a brilliant scientist, and he's put his neck on the line by advocating a much
still working stuff out.
Any scientist these days,
we're gonna be here for 3 hours, so settle the fuck in. Get some ice cream in a minute.
And says that the archaeological narrative is wrong, immediately gets massively attacked, and I think that's most unfortunate. A couple of points I'd like to make about this. First of all, we said at the beginning, most archaeology, certainly in the industrialized countries, is a result of a dam or a road being built and archaeologists being called in to see if there's anything there. It's not a targeted search. It's kind of random. Something's happening and archaeologists go in there. And then there's huge areas of the world that have had very little archaeology done in them. Those include the Amazon rainforest, where I've just been. I've been 3 weeks in the Brazilian Amazon and another couple of weeks in Peru. And there are extraordinary revelations coming out of the Amazon rainforest. Now, the Amazon rainforest, up until very recently, had very little archaeology done. You're talking about 6 million square kilometers of the Earth's surface, which has hardly been touched by archaeology. And now it is being touched by archaeology, thanks to LIDAR, which is identifying enormous structures.
There's
under the
amazing
canopy.
things going on with
We're
LiDAR
finding
right
that we
now.
have to rewrite the whole story of the Amazon, that there were potentially populations of millions living in the Amazon, that there were cities, they were joined by roads hundreds of kilometers in length.
And there
All
was
of these
one
things are recent
account
discoveries which says
from a
we should be thinking
conquistador
again about the
Castellano,
Amazon.
something
Same
like that.
goes for the submerged continental shelves, 27 million square kilometers of the best real estate on Earth that were above water during the Ice Age are underwater now. Yes, there's been some marine archaeology, but not enough to rule out the possibility of a lost civilization. And the same with the Sahara Desert, 9 million square kilometers. A little bit of archaeology done, but before archaeologists say there was no lost civilization, this is what the Society for American Archaeology said in their open letter to Netflix, complaining about my show. They said, we know that there was no lost civilization during the Ice Age. And my question to them is, how can they possibly know
Amazon,
that
yes,
when they've
Terra
looked
Preta
at
looks to be
relatively small
man-made.
areas
That's
of the Earth?
really
The
what
picture
people
is
think.
not complete. They should be saying, we don't think there was a lost civilization during the Ice Age, fine. But to say we know there wasn't, that's completely wrong.
Well, it's silly, and it's also, it becomes more and more of a problem the more things get discovered. And the more they push back harder
That's
and
right.
more emotionally and more religiously.
Yeah.
It's really kind of crazy the way they behave, that is as if they have like an accurate map.
Yeah.
Like the way they viewed some of the older hieroglyphs that depict civilizations that were 30,000 years ago, like kings and the lineage.
King lists from ancient Egypt go back 30 plus thousand years.
But they want to pretend that those are myth.
Yeah, and yet for their chronology of ancient Egypt, they actually use the king lists. The moment those king lists start giving dates that fall within dates that archaeologists like,
1 second.
everything before those dates, they say, oh, they just made it up.
How crazy is that? Wouldn't it be a fascinating alternative if you were an archaeologist to go, you know what? Maybe this king's list is legit. Maybe this thing really is 30, 40,000 years old.
Yeah.
And maybe that explains a lot. And now we have to figure out how.
Yeah.
How'd they do it?
It would be a fascinating alternative, but unfortunately, it's not the way that archaeology works at the moment. I repeat, a lot of archaeologists have accused me of accusing them of a conspiracy against me and trying to...
They don't need a conspiracy. They all think the same.
Yeah, I don't see any conspiracy. I see people who do believe what they're saying and who think I'm wrong, but who feel that I'm such a threat to the narrative that they present that I must be neutralized in any way possible. And that's a sad state of affairs. Science should embrace and explore new and different ideas, and particularly when it comes to the human past. Look, I mean, if I get in an airplane, I do want the pilot to be a properly qualified pilot. I want him to have undergone all the training and to be really good at what he does. But flying an airplane and studying the human past are two different things. And archaeologists often compare themselves to airline pilots.
Not
they
that
say,
different.
you wouldn't get in an airplane without a properly trained pilot. So why are you studying the past without a properly trained archaeologist?
Oh my gosh, that's obnoxious, dude.
You've got blinkers on.
People are full of
You've
themselves.
got a very narrow perspective of what the past could be. And you're defending and protecting that perspective and imposing a narrative about the past on the public. And that's where we get into a kind of religious aspect.
JC's 100% right here,
become
bro.
the high priests of the past.
Well, like Zahi Hawass is an excellent example in Egypt.
Zahi is an excellent example.
He does not want to even entertain the notion that there's
Egyptologists
some sort of a gap in
cult.
the knowledge.
I can't see what you said, JC, but you're right, bro.
If you just say the word Atlantis to Zahi Hawass, he goes berserk. He absolutely goes nuts.
Can't see that far.
And that's irrational too, since we know that the Atlantis story comes from Plato. We know that Plato said the source of that story was in ancient Egypt, in the Temple of Neith at Sais in the Delta. An ancestor, Solon, visited that temple and was told the story, which he put into the word. Atlantis is not an ancient Egyptian word. That's one of the problems. But he called it Atlantis. But at Edfu in Upper Egypt, there's a whole story of a homeland of the primeval ones that was destroyed in a great cataclysm and flooded by the sea, leaving only a few survivors who traveled around the world seeking to restart civilization. It's told very clearly in the Edfu building texts, which fortunately have now been completely translated, sadly only into German. I hope we'll see the full English translation in due course, but the translations I was working from when I first studied them are very good, and they've been reinforced and supported by this new fuller translation. So I think the Atlantis story does have an ancient Egyptian origin, and I think the ancient Egyptians should be proud of it rather than throwing it away. And also, archaeologists should not seek to isolate the story of Atlantis from other flood myths and traditions all around the world. And that's a problem too. I mean, we have hundreds of myths and traditions from countries all around the globe which speak of a great global cataclysm, a huge flood, often wildfires.
Yes, and there's lots of stuff.
Destruction
From
of human beings and of animals. A few survivors.
Many different
who seek to restart civilization. It's a global story, not a.
These stories
story
are real. These stories are real. There is
the same
truth
story
in
from so
stories of
many
indigenous
different
people,
cultures,
including
at what point in
these
time
ones.
do you go, maybe there's something to this? I mean, it's just very strange to try to deny that.
Again, we have this,
especially with the physical evidence.
Yeah, especially with the physical evidence, and it's interesting with the physical evidence, like like Göbekli Tepe, which is 11,600 years old. I mean, it used to be argued, Robert Schoch and John Anthony West's work on the Great Sphinx, suggesting that the Sphinx could be 12,000 plus years old. It used to be argued that was impossible because there was no other site anywhere in the world, no other megalithic site of the same age. And then we discover Göbekli Tepe, and it's 11,600 years old. Now, if you can make Göbekli Tepe with its 20-ton megaliths, beautifully carved representations of human and animal figures in those pillars, if you can do that, you can cut the Great Sphinx out of bedrock as well. There's no reason to dismiss the geological evidence of the Great Sphinx anymore. But instead, what archaeology is doing is trying to finesse Göbekli Tepe. They're trying to say, oh, there was this gradual build-up to Göbekli Tepe. And they now talk about a people who they call...
There's no gradual build-up.
Again, we don't know what they call
it's themselves.
A lie.
Flynn Dibble's
who were predecessors of Göbekli Tepe around 14,000 years ago. And they show things that look like a tiny little stone wall that they built, the sort of thing that you can find, a dry stone wall that you can find anywhere in Wales to this day, you know. And this is supposed to be a prequel to Göbekli Tepe. I'm sorry, you just don't start off making dry stone walls and then wake up one morning and create 20-ton megaliths in huge stone circles, perfectly astronomically aligned, as we have at Göbekli Tepe.
Not only that, but how? Like, what did they do? How are you even, where are you getting those 20-ton megaliths from? How far do they have to transport?
In the case of Göbekli Tepe, not far.
How far?
Oh, hundreds of meters. I've stood on top of one megalith that they partially cut out of the bedrock with the T shape, but then they found a fault in it and they left it there. Oh. It would have been a 30-ton megalith. They clearly intended to release it from the bedrock, but it had a fault, so they left it alone.
Guys, I'm so sorry. I don't know what the heck I was thinking. I literally just exited out of it. I meant to just start pulling up some visuals.
The issue of the quarries for the rock at Göbekli Tepe is not too big a problem.
But the transportation of those?
Even the transportation, you get enough people working together, and they can move large stones. That's not in dispute. But that's where the question comes: how do you get enough people together? How do you have the organizational skills? Where do you have the mindset that plans something like this at the beginning? And that is the problem that is not answered in the case of Göbekli Tepe. That happening suddenly.
And what were they using for tools?
They're supposed to have just been using stone. There's not supposed to have been any metals at that period.
Not even brass.
Not even brass. Not even copper. I have a complicated
absolute
view on Göbekli
nonsense.
Tepe. Let's say it's my hypothesis. It's not a fact. I don't claim this is a fact. I think that what we're looking at Göbekli Tepe, there's no doubt that the population of around Göbekli Tepe were all hunter-gatherers.
Yep.
When Göbekli Tepe started to be made. And that's the weirdest thing of all, because previously archaeology always used to say hunter-gatherer cultures did not have the manpower, did not have the organizational skills, could not generate the surpluses that would allow people to specialize in architecture and engineering and astronomy and so on. So it used to be said that hunter-gatherers couldn't do that. Now archaeologists have backpedaled on that, and they're saying, well, yeah, clearly hunter-gatherers did it. The funny thing is that during the 1,000 years
at least iron
Tepe functions, and it runs from roughly 11,600 years ago to say 9,600 years ago. During the 10,600 years ago, during those 1,000 years, the population of Göbekli Tepe transitions from being hunter-gatherers to being agriculturalists. So we see two new ideas suddenly appearing at Göbekli Tepe: enormous megalithic architecture and a shift from hunter-gathering to agriculture. And what Göbekli Tepe looks like to me is a transfer of technology, that people who already knew how to work megalithic architecture and align it precisely to the risings of particular stars, for example, Sirius, came to Göbekli Tepe at a time of chaos and cataclysm in the world, and they sought to introduce a new way of thinking. I think Göbekli Tepe was created as a project to mobilize the local community, to give them something to work on, to bring them together. And it's not an accident that during that 1,000 years they transitioned from hunter-gathering to agriculture. I don't see massive technical complications in creating Göbekli Tepe, except those very precise alignments. But what I do see is a sudden appearance of something that shouldn't have been there.
What do you mean?
And that requires explanation.
How did they determine the emergence of agriculture versus agriculture that it existed in some areas and not others, like it does now? Like you can go to the Amazon and you can see hunter-gatherers, and then you can go to Sao Paulo and see a major metropolitan city.
I was just in Manaus, and it's fascinating, actually. They have a tower up there on the edge of the jungle.
This episode is brought to you by Goldco. The Fed has just declared war on Americans. They want to be a cashless society using a digital dollar. That means no greenbacks for swap meets or garage sales. No tooth fairy or piggy banks. No rainy day savings. No extra quarters for the meter. No more selling extra items for cash. No buying anything with privacy.
I mean, look, I'm with you. I'm with you guys.
This episode is brought to you by
terrible whiskey
road, or building apartment buildings, or building a dam. And they call in archaeologists to see if there's any interesting archaeology there. And this is part of the problem I have with
that's what they do
with archaeology as a discipline. It likes to think of itself as scientific, but what I think it's primarily doing, and it is weird, is trying to control the narrative about the past.
Do you think that's because the people that are in control of archaeology, the academics, the professors,
it's not science.
These people have written books on these things, have lectured on these things, and they've been very specific about timelines and dates.
Yeah, I think it's a complicated it's a complicated mixture of things. First of all, because archaeology is so desperate to be seen as a science, it tries as hard as possible to distance itself from any ideas that might be seen as woo-woo.
It's hilarious.
You know, anything out on the edge, archaeology doesn't want to associate itself with. And then it takes the next step and really seeks to attack out on the edge ideas. Now, I don't know why the possibility of a lost civilization during the Ice Age should be an out on the edge idea. We've had lost civilizations before.
It wasn't a science even then, I don't think.
Today in Pakistan, wasn't known about until the 1920s. It was found by accident. And you know, every turn of the archaeologist's spade can reveal
I wonder what else
new information. But the reaction to my proposal that we've forgotten an episode in the human story, it's always been hostile since I published Fingerprints of the Gods in 1995. But with Ancient Apocalypse, much bigger platform reaching a much wider audience, the reaction was just hysterical. And it went on for a very long time. And it appeared to me, I don't think it's a conspiracy. I don't think archaeologists are involved in a conspiracy. I think the people who are attacking me genuinely believe in what they're saying, and they genuinely think I'm harmful. But that's like calling.
These people do. Yes, they genuinely believe. Wait, did we just restart the episode?
It looks like that.
Oh my gosh. What the heck just happened?
And how didn't we notice it for 3 minutes?
3 minutes?
3 seconds.
Yo, what? Guys, did anyone else not notice? What the heck?
Done in them. The weirdest thing of all, because previously archaeology always used to say hunter-gatherer cultures did not have under the rainforest canopy.
Crazy.
And there's a huge untold story. So one of the places I would look, things exist, but the clearances ultimately will destroy the entire Amazon if they're allowed to continue. Jacosa, on the left, a square samples are more than 8,000 years old. And that's just in the areas that have been surveyed.
6-hour stream.
Very likely Terra Preta goes back much, much, much earlier than that.
Terra Preta.
Because it's such an issue. To reproduce.
This is what somebody had brought up in the comments earlier.
Brazilian archaeologist and geologist. They reckon that there's thousands of these things still under the rainforest canopy, and there's a huge untold story. So one of the places I would look for a lost civilization is the Amazon rainforest.
The Amazon rainforest. I'm going to bring up some of these LiDAR images.
Replenishes itself. How does it do that?
It's something to do with microbes and bacteria that are in the soil, and they keep on regenerating. They don't get used up. It's a kind of miracle. It's not fully understood. Nobody can say they fully understand terra preta, but what is fully understood, and it's understood by settlers, is that if they plant on terra preta, they're going to get rich crops coming out of it.
Is there a way to reproduce that in America?
Attempts have been made to reproduce it, and biochar is one of the words that comes to mind.
I will do it.
There's even indications that some of the modern indigenous peoples of the Amazon are still creating terra preta. This is a whole mystery that needs to be investigated much further. We're looking at the oldest examples are more than 8,000 years old, and that's just in the areas that have been surveyed. Very likely terra preta goes back much, much, much earlier than that.
Because it's such an issue with modern farmlands where they have to use these modern fertilizers,
which are not helpful in many ways.
And they run off. Like the topsoil's worn out.
Yeah.
So this is ground penetrating radar, which they can use to see through the thing.
This would be one of the many ways in which our so-called high-tech industrialized society could learn from indigenous cultures. We could learn a lot from them about living in harmony with the environment, and about clever things like terra preta, clever things like curare, which is another Amazonian invention, which is the basis of modern anesthesiology. How did they do that? I
did not know that.
There's 11 ingredients in curare, and those ingredients are not active on their own. You have to cook them all together to get this poison, which is a muscle relaxant. Why a muscle relaxant? Because if you're going to shoot a monkey 200 feet up a tree with your arrow, you don't want it coiling its tail around the tree when it dies. You want it to drop to the ground. Ayahuasca is another Amazonian invention, and again, it consists of several ingredients, two in particular, neither of which are active on their own, but which only work when cooked together. So what I see in the Amazon is traces of a lost science, a scientific.
There's definitely lost civilizations. In the
can I show some pictures of these geoglyphs?
Please.
We have to hook up the magical
HDMI.
Unfortunately,
I wish I could just show you what they're looking at right now, but they don't.
I'll just show a few slides of them. I forget which side the HDMI is in. I think it's in that side.
Careful with the water.
Yeah.
I'll see if I can find what he's looking at.
Okay. Are we on screen?
We will be momentarily. Here we go.
Yeah, so this shows the Amazon, 6.7 million square kilometers. There's still 5.5 million left covered by rainforest. That's bigger than the entire subcontinent of India, and hardly any archaeology has been done. And the archaeology that is being done is fascinating. And it's particularly in the state of Acre, in the southwest of Brazil, that we're seeing these extraordinary geoglyphs. Now, I'm on the left there. That's Martti Parsanen from the University of Helsinki, and that is Fabio Filho, who's the LiDAR expert, and that's Alceu Ranzi, who's a Brazilian geographer and archaeologist. And we're looking at the latest LiDAR discoveries, and there I'm about to take off in a plane with these two guys. It was just incredible to fly over there. I've flown over the Nazca lines many times, but to fly over this and to see these huge earthworks on a scale of hundreds of meters sitting there, often
there's no video, guys. I'm so sorry.
On by farms.
I want to see what they're talking
about.
Very,
very, very exciting.
And what's the conventional explanation for these things?
There is no conventional explanation, because really it's only begun to be studied. I'll say you first noticed them on an overflight more than 20 years ago, but it's only relatively recently that they've started to get the funding. And I want to pay tribute to Eugene Jong.
This is recent, October 10th, 2023. Wow.
Who has provided funding for these guys to continue their work, and who's also provided funding to the Comet Research Group, and who's also provided funding for the DMT research that's being done at UCSD.
What's his name?
Eugene Jong. He's a brilliant guy.
Jong.
Jhong. He's a brilliant philanthropist, and he's so open-minded, and he's looking to support research in areas that the mainstream just won't touch.
That's amazing.
So
Good
we're
for
looking at
him.
Fazenda Sipoal here, where we have
Geoglyphs, not
an
petroglyphs, that's what he
octagon with
said.
rounded corners.
What's up, boys?
And
Comments.
then this is
Sup,
Santa's
Arcade.
shot of the same place, and you can see what's going on. You see the smoke in the background there?
Mhm.
That's the Amazon burning. That's settlers clearing the Amazon to create more farms. But in the foreground, we have this this enormous geometrical event, which is a huge oval surrounding a square.
And did they find this once they started clearing? Is
Dude, the
that when
episode
This was found
Shermer
as a result of
was
the clearance.
incredible.
That's
If you
how
haven't
that's
heard of
how
that,
it became,
you got to check
archaeologists
that one
became
out.
aware that these things exist.
So before that, this was completely covered with trees.
Completely covered with rainforest. It
He
was only the
shat all over
it's a
Shermer.
sort of mixed blessing or mixed curse, if you like, because the clearances made it possible for us to know that these things exist. But the clearances ultimately will destroy the entire Amazon if they're allowed to continue. Jacosa, on the left, a square surrounding a circle. And here's a couple of Santa shots of Jacosa. You can see there's a large square earthwork and a circle in it. That's almost, not quite, but almost like the Greek exercise of squaring the circle. It's like geometrical exercises are taking place here in the Amazon. Again, a square with these curious scallops cut into the side of it, and a circle. There's just so much of this of this stuff. Taquino, absolutely giant geoglyph, and these things really, on the old view of the Amazon, shouldn't exist. They involve enormous expenditure of effort. Creating these earthworks is a huge job. If there was a lot of stone in the Amazon, I think we'd see stone circles on them as well. There's one place further north called Rego Grande where there is an earthwork with a stone circle in it because stone is locally available.
So do you think this was the base of a structure? Like, what is the speculation?
No, I don't think so. I've
think
talked
we're
to
gonna split this
indigenous
up into two
people
parts,
there
boys.
who still
But,
respect and revere them.
we'll be here for another hour.
And
so
they
let's
say
do
that
this. I'll
they
do some
were
longer
for
streams
shamanic
later when I'm
journeying,
back home,
that
but I'm in
the
Alabama right
population
now
would gather
recording stuff.
within them. There would be
Gotta go out and
certain
meet some
areas
people out
that
in
might be
Gulf
reserved
Shores.
for the shamans. For example, the square on the left, those two cut out areas, top left and right of that square, it suggested that shamans were in there and the rest of the population were in the other area, and they were undertaking visionary journeys, perhaps using ayahuasca. Of course, the Amazonian peoples are experts in the properties of indigenous plants.
So this is their folklore, or this is their story?
Yes, this is the story of indigenous
So that's what
indigenous
they say,
people.
these things.
I talked to an Apurina elder, and he said, we don't know exactly why these places were made. They were made so long ago, but we respect them, we revere them, and we think that they were used by shamans in the distant past.
So they were aware of them before the clearing? And
Yeah,
everything?
they were aware of them before the clearing, and
Did
they
use
revered them.
they
Yes,
just-
they used them, and they still
They
have
were aware of
community
them before the
gatherings in them.
clearing.
No, they weren't. They
Wow.
weren't a base for structures. I'm drawing attention here to Severino
I wonder how they
Calazans,
knew.
this large square on the left there, which has
They could probably
coincidentally the same footprint
Spend a lot
as
of
the
time
Great
with
very
Pyramid
upset
of
that we
Giza.
can't
It just
see
shows
this
you the
stuff.
What?
size
very
of
upset that the
that
video won't play.
enormous earthwork.
Let's see if I can screw around with the
But
settings
it's a
while we
mystery.
listen.
More work needs to be done, and much more needs to be surveyed. And thanks to LiDAR, that can be done non-invasively. We can spot these things. Very small teams can go in and do a bit of excavation there and figure out what was going on. I think the story is going to go back further and further into the past.
Is there any evidence of wood structures? Like, did they make buildings out of wood back then?
Not that I'm aware of.
When did people start using wood as a structure?
I think you can trace wood back as a structure hundreds of thousands of years.
But
There'd be no way
when
of
did they
knowing,
start using
honestly.
it in, like, if you see like the ancient Mayan civilizations, what you find in the Amazon, you don't find ancient wood structures.
The stuff
do
with
you?
I think
Randall
that's largely an
Carlson, the
artifact
stuff
of
you're
the fact
referring
that
to,
wood doesn't
that was all a
preserve very
scam.
well.
There's been a bunch of
So how
videos
do
on
we
it.
know that there
Unfortunately,
weren't
Randall
wood
got
structures?
tricked
There
by
may
an
well be.
asshole.
over these?
There may well have been, which
Right.
have just rotted away,
Right.
and gone. There may well have been wooden structures there.
Because it kind of looks like foundations.
It does look like foundations, and it's just a very weird thing. But I think the main point is
Someone made it.
someone made it,
Yeah.
and it involved a very large amount of organized labor in order to make it. There had to be the will and the intent in order to do that. It's interesting that the patterns are geometrical.
And are they geometrical, like with the perfect length? And
Yes,
like
yes, they're very
match up with each
they're
other?
very, very good,
Guys, I'm just gonna do
Fazenda
one thing.
Piranha
I'm gonna
and
see if we
Severino
can get
Calazans are
the
both
video. I'm just going to try to
aligned
restart my
true
Spotify. So
astronomical north.
I'm going to
That's
stay here,
different from
but
compass north.
just like 4143. Bear with me for a second, please.
Yeah, 4143.
Requires us.
Joe Rogan podcast.
We did
Check it out.
it. We did
The
it.
Joe Rogan
I
Experience.
don't know why. but
Train by
this
day,
is-
Joe Rogan podcast by night, all day.
Not, in my view, Kafre.
Yeah.
And it involved, and Severina Calazans are both aligned to true astronomical north. That's different from compass north. That requires astronomy. You can't get true north without using astronomy. So this tells us not only was there a culture that was
Look at that.
capable of creating large-scale public projects, but also they had astronomers amongst them.
Of course, they had astronomers. Stars are very
It's,
important to a
it's-
lot of
it's
primitive
a good,
societies.
It's a good mystery. The other thing is,
Someone tell me if the
that
audio is
geometrical
having a problem.
patterns are very common experience in ayahuasca visions in altered states of consciousness.
wouldn't
Our
you know,
culture
you
tends to
weird British.
despise altered states of consciousness, although fortunately that's changing. But in the Amazon and many indigenous cultures, they're regarded as extremely important, that we can't confine ourselves to the everyday wide awake state of consciousness that requires us to interface with the physical
Shout
world.
out,
There are other
episode
states of
32,
consciousness which are also
Capitalism
valuable
and
which bring teachings.
Coffee.
And
Our
it's
culture
just one of
chooses
those
its
facts
drugs.
that most people who drink ayahuasca, most of the time, at some point, will experience geometrical visions. So there's a question: is there a connection here between the use of ayahuasca and the geometrical patterns? There's
I don't need to be
a
like that.
huge rock.
Thanks, JC.
wall,
Appreciate it.
has been found in the Colombian Amazon, Serra de la Lindosa, which I'm hoping to get to this year. 8 kilometers long, covered in rock paintings. The rock paintings are dated more than 12,000 years old. They show extinct megafauna. They show giant sloths, which went extinct during the Younger Dryas, for example. And they
Look
also
at
show the
that.
kind of entities
How
that are seen
incredible.
in ayahuasca visions. They show the same sort of patterns, the same geometric.
Why is Jamie
patterns
not
that are
pulling
seen
this
in
up right now?
ayahuasca. So there's a
Do
sense
you
that
have any images of this?
There we
place?
go.
Serra de la Lindosa. Just
You're
this-
connected to the.
yeah, I don't have images of La Lindosa,
Oh, maybe you can Google it
but if
or give the plug
Yeah,
back.
I'll
to
Come on,
check
Jamie.
Jamie.
back. I was trying to Google it and I didn't find anything. And I might have spelled or guessed wrong on Sarah
How do you spell it?
Della
La Lindosa,
La Lindosa.
yeah. Let me just.
I got it. I got it.
You got it?
Yeah.
You're gonna have to give him the cord real quick, and then he'll give it back to you.
Okay, there you go.
Thanks,
it's,
JC. I felt pretty strong
literally
about that
an
one. I was happy that
8
people agreed with me.
Sistine Chapel in the Colombian Amazon. That's the other thing. I mentioned there's not a lot of rock in the Amazon. Where there is rock, they used it. There's rock paintings all over the Amazon where rock is available. These kind of things. Yeah, that's it. These are characteristic of ayahuasca visions, but in this case, they're more than 12,000 years old. Now, does that prove they were using ayahuasca 12,000 years ago? No, but
That's
it
very similar to like a tryptamine vision. though.
totally,
Thanks, Thomas.
totally. It
Appreciate
does
that,
suggest
brother.
that some tryptamine was being accessed at that time and resulting in these visionary images.
Boy, they shitty
Oh, that's the one we
drawings,
just looked
aren't
at.
they? Their drawing was terrible.
But bear in mind that they're clambering 100 feet up a sheer cliff. in order to
Still, guys, do a better job.
create,
It's ridiculous.
create these paintings.
Those
Wow.
the people were so fat. Are those people or sea
Dude,
turtles? What are those?
The
things?
background is so white on that
It's
rock.
really
That's
interesting. To see.
cool.
So this is 11,000. How old?
12,000.
12,000 plus.
Yeah, 12,000 plus years old.
It's interesting because if you see the paintings that they found in that cave in France, those are 30 plus thousand years
Oh
old.
yeah,
right?
there's paintings in France. If you go to Chauvet,
Yeah.
you're looking 36,000 years old.
Can you go to those, Jamie?
Hohenstein-Stadel in
100%
Germany.
JC.
It's that amazing Werner Herzog documentary.
They often have
I think was the Cave of Dreams.
Cave of Dreams. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. They often
Look at
have.
that.
We're looking at Lascaux. Hang on the. Yeah, we're looking at Lascaux there. The bull painting there.
They
It's
were
interesting.
better.
Look at the
artists.
way that the light is hitting.
I have to confess,
painting.
They're quite a bit
this artist-
better.
this
These
artist
were
very good.
likely
If you go-
used
Jamie, if you go to the NPR, the
to
painting of a bull,
tell stories.
one step left from where you are.
I don't know
that
if he's going to touch on that.
one. This is very interesting.
But they would be
there has
used
been
with
an argument
fire.
made
It would
by,
move it. It would simulate movement.
a couple of astronomers that what is depicted there is the constellation of Taurus, and that in itself is heresy because archaeologists
Dude, that's
who want to
insane.
give everything to the Greeks say that it was the Greeks who invented the constellations of the zodiac,
Hmm.
and
I haven't seen
not
Cave of
showing
Dreams.
Why do they think that represents the constellation?
because of the 6 little dots, which are not, I think, on the head. I think they're somewhere behind, not in this picture, which is often how the Pleiades are seen. They're seen that actually there are 7 Pleiades, but often to the naked eye you see 6. And the positioning of the Pleiades in relation to the constellation of Taurus
Is that it right there?
is the basis for that argument. It could be. I'm not sure. It's so long
Oh,
since I've
yeah.
looked at
I've
it.
heard about this, but I haven't
know
seen the
that there are
documentary. We'll
Six
have to watch
dots
it.
there.
Yeah, we
so this
definitely
cave
should.
art was going on all
Me and
around
Higgy
the
are
world.
literally
It's
doing a
found- some of the
documentary right
oldest
now.
art has been found in Indonesia.
We're also watching
Oh, here
one
it is.
documentary a day. Ish.
Yeah, there's the Pleiades. The whole argument about the Pleiades.
Hmm.
It's those dots exactly.
Yeah.
The ones you pointed to above the back of the bull. 1,
Wow.
2, 3, 4, 5,
I'm
6.
getting a little claim. I'm going to
that
have
is
to
how the Pleiades are often seen.
pull
with the
it
naked
on
eye.
Can you go back
this,
to the
actually,
other?
unfortunately.
Wow.
You know, that it's an argument. It's not accepted by mainstream archaeology because of their narrative, which is that the discovery of the constellations of the zodiac is given to the Greeks or perhaps to the Mesopotamians before the Greeks. It's not thought that any human
Yeah, and
culture
These
could have
are
noticed the constellations of the zodiac before that, and that's really absurd because the constellations of the zodiac are on the path of the sun. The sun rises against the background of a
dude. Every
different
time I listen to this
constellation
guy,
every
it
month.
blows my mind.
And,
dude,
and
he's
how would the
fucking
ancients
incredible.
have missed that, especially since the skies were an ever-present phenomenon to them in a
Yeah,
way that they
this
are
right
not
here.
to us.
Right.
This is
We're
what I'm talking.
cut off from the skies by light pollution, but the ancients were not.
What a fascinating
were not cut
concept
off
that
from
they
the
knew
skies.
about the constellations 30 plus thousand years
Yeah,
ago.
and I believe they did, and we see that again in Göbekli Tepe in Pillar 43 in Enclosure D. You see a constellation that we recognize as Sagittarius.
Brian and I were talking about one of the ancient versions of human beings, and I sent him this the other day
Mhm.
because I read this article that I thought was amazing, where it was talking about they found wooden structures that were 500,000 years old.
Mhm. That's right.
Yeah, so I'll send you this, Jamie.
You sent that to me as well.
Yes, I did. Yeah. This is very wild, right?
I'm going to
Because
get it so I
that's,
can
what is
share
that?
what
Well,
he's
500,000
looking at, and then
500,000
not
years
get
ago
strikes
is
for sharing this
pre-
video.
Anatomically modern humans.
Right.
The earliest example of anatomically modern humans so far found is about
Yes, JC, the
300,000 years,
Minoans.
and that's from
Kind of the
Morocco.
proto Greeks.
But there's a new thinking going on
Mycenaeans.
now. What about the Neanderthals, who we know that anatomically modern humans interbred with? Maybe the Neanderthals are just another anatomically modern human form. Maybe they're not.
Right.
They're not a different species. They're Homo neanderthalensis as opposed to Homo sapiens. But maybe it was all one, and there were different forms of human beings at that time. If in that case, these wooden structures would fit within the Neanderthal time frame.
This is that same culture, Jamie, that Brian was telling us buried their dead in a very sophisticated way, where they had to crawl through these cave.
No, Brian was
systems.
talking about Homo naledi.
I think this is Homo naledi.
This is from
I
South
think that's
Africa?
what they're talking about. I believe that's what they were talking about.
Wooden structure from Zambia. It's from Zambia. Homo
This is
naledi is in
rough.
South
I'll figure
Africa,
this
and
out.
it is fascinating. And Lee Berger, who I
Here
mentioned
it
to
is.
you,
A species similar to Homo naledi.
yeah,
See, Homo, how do you say that word?
Homo naledi.
No, the other one. Homo
Heidelbergensis, Heidelberg, some remains found near Heidelberg in Germany.
So this is what it says. We don't know exactly what species made the structure, but Homo,
This.
how do you say it again? Homo
Government pay for this.
Heidelbergensis, or a species similar to Homo naledi.
might be candidates.
Yeah. Interesting.
So Homo naledi is interesting. That's the result of a National Geographic explorer in residence called Lee Berger. And he, as you discussed with Brian, we won't go over it again, but he found evidence of deliberate burial in a very complicated, difficult cave system
That'll work.
which you can hardly access.
Yeah.
And of course, immediately
Sorry,
this
guys.
was published.
I'm not sorry.
And it was published in a Netflix documentary. The archaeological establishment descended on him like a ton of bricks.
Of course they did.
and
That's what the
tried to find
archaeological
all kinds of reasons why
establishment
it
does.
couldn't possibly be deliberate burial. Whereas I think it would be much more interesting if archaeology tried to, first of all, look at all kinds of reasons why it could be deliberate burial, because that opens many doors. Whereas saying, no, it's impossible, just closes all the doors.
Well, what are the alternative
AC.
explanations for why they had mass burial sites?
AC
inside
gets
of a
it, bro.
cave?
They fell there, something like that.
All of them?
Yeah, all
Over
of them.
many
and somehow
years?
buried themselves under the topsoil, and then left engravings on the cave walls, which
Yeah.
are very, very similar to engravings that we find in the caves of France, for example.
Well, it does make sense, though, that ancient human species would slowly learn the things that we learned. They would slowly pick up tool making.
You don't know
They
how
would slowly
slowly.
pick up the ability to harness fire.
Why would that
And
make
that
sense?
as
Joe
time
Rogan,
went
he's talking
on,
out of his ass.
the
He's doing this thing
species
where he
became
like
more sophisticated,
long
more
talks. I
advanced
hate
as
it. It's most
evolved.
annoying.
It would just
But it's fine. I
refine
really
those
like the guy.
methods.
Yeah, that does make sense.
But he
The-
is
the
retarded.
question is, when did it
For the
happen? This
record.
is why I sometimes wear a
Yes.
T-shirt, and I did on the last show with you, which says stuff just keeps on getting older.
Yes.
And a lot of people don't understand what I mean by that. But what I mean by it is that archaeological discoveries are constantly pushing horizons back, but not considering the implications of that. It wasn't so long ago that anatomically modern humans were thought to be just 50,000 years old. Now, if anatomically modern humans with the modern brain, with our capacities and abilities, have only existed for 50,000 years, that doesn't leave a lot of room for a lost civilization to come and go. But then we find 196,000 years ago from Ethiopia, and then more recently 300,000 years ago from Morocco. And suddenly the
This stuff has been
expanses of
happening
time
within like
that
just
have
the
not
last
been
few years, by the way.
investigated,
This is
in which
very,
a
very
civilization
recent.
could have risen and fallen, become much greater. And that's why it's important that stuff just keeps on getting older.
Very fascinating also that the oldest known ones are from Africa.
Yeah.
And obviously that's where Egypt is.
Yes, and that's
Yeah.
that's exactly where Egypt
Yeah.
is, and you know, we must recognize Egypt as an African culture.
Yeah.
That is what the ancient Egyptians were.
It doesn't mean
I believe their
anything, though.
language was belonged to the Hamitic language family, which is closely related to the Somali language, for example, in East Africa. African culture,
Well, that
incredibly
okay.
sophisticated,
It is significant
incredibly
then.
advanced, doing stuff that we just don't know how to do today. Archaeologists will tell you they could build a Great Pyramid, but I defy
Alright.
them to do that. The Great
Don't be
Pyramid
the
is literally
Black Hebrew Israelite out
impossible.
here.
It's something that doesn't make any sense. It certainly doesn't make sense as the tomb of a megalomaniac pharaoh, which is what we're told it was.
It's not.
Well, it's
Look,
also
that
sort of the
it's not a thing.
ultimate-
If you think
if
that
you
the
wanted to
pyramids
leave
are a tomb, you're
behind
wrong.
evidence
They're
of
not.
culture.
It's they keep telling you that, but
Something
there's
that-
no evidence for it.
If there was a cataclysm and people did have to sort of rethink the history of the world, that would be the best thing to leave.
Time capsule.
Because
Yeah.
it's so insanely sophisticated that you're forced to sort of reckon with this idea that something might have existed before us.
Yeah, definitely. And it incorporates all kinds of interesting math. It incorporates pi, which again is supposed to have been discovered by the Greeks. It incorporates the dimensions of the earth on a particular scale. There's a lot about the Great Pyramid which suggests that it was intended to transmit information to the future. And that's one of the reasons why it's so big and so enormous, and why we keep on finding new chambers and passageways inside the Great Pyramid.
Keep on keeping on, brother.
called
They're
scan
not looking. They
pyramids,
could have
which is
found them
now
all a
going
long
on,
time ago if they
which is
wanted
using
to.
the latest tech, and they've identified a second Grand Gallery above the Grand Gallery. The Grand Gallery is one of the wonderful features of the Great Pyramid. It's 30 feet high, 120 feet long. rising up through the center of the pyramid. But now we know there's a second one above it that hasn't been explored yet. And that's a result of scanned pyramids. There's corridors and passageways that we didn't know were there. So the Great Pyramid is gradually, bit by bit, revealing its secrets. And it's almost as though it was waiting for a time.
I'm not sure what you mean there,
human
Frenchie.
beings were ready to receive those secrets and had the ability to decode them.
How do they access the second Grand Gallery?
Scanning. It's all
I mean humans. How can humans get into it?
It could that's a very good question. It's there. The question is, at what point was it made? Was it part it should have been part of the original construction of the Great Pyramid. As they were building the Great Pyramid, they created one Grand Gallery and they created another.
Is it the same size?
It looks to be the same size, yeah. From the scanning, which the scanning just shows a void, but I'm informed reliably that the recent investigation has identified that void as another Grand Gallery, which is inside the Great Pyramid. And the Grand Gallery is one of the wonders of the world.
So it could have artifacts in it.
It could have artifacts in it. Same goes for those shafts that cut through the walls of the Queen's Chamber.
Who decides that it's a gallery?
Queen's Chamber and King's Chamber.
I think the Egyptologists
I resist these names that archaeologists have applied to the Great Pyramid. I resist the notion that it was the tomb of Khufu. I resist the notion that the subterranean chamber, which is 100 feet vertically beneath the base of the Great Pyramid, was intended to be Khufu's tomb chamber, but then they just changed their minds and abandoned it. And then they built the one that's now called the Queen's Chamber. That was intended to be for Khufu, but they abandoned that as well. Then they went up the Grand Gallery and they created the so-called King's Chamber. And because it has a sarcophagus in it, and for no other reason,
I don't believe it,
that is said to have been the original burial place of Khufu. It's not enough evidence, in my view.
And the
it's like the thing with the
Khufu
T-Rex.
From
like, oh, the T-Rex arms were used for cuddling.
Vision that if you
little tickling mating arms.
That's not even a joke. Somebody tried to say that. Somebody tried to claim.
There is something along
science
those lines,
books.
and it's Thutmosis the fourth.
Worse
or
than
the
that.
third,
It was at
if I
a
remember
museum.
correctly. In other words, he's a later pharaoh
was in Houston,
from the
remember?
time of the Old Kingdom, and he put
Um,
between the paws
Frenchie,
of the
I think
Sphinx
you're
a
right,
stela,
but I
which is
also
called the Dream Stela, and in it he records a
You know,
dream that he had. That time
he
the Sphinx
doesn't
was buried up to its neck in
pretend like other
sand,
people that
and
he
the
is.
dream
He has the
was
only
that he should clear
the only
the
perspective.
Sphinx. The Sphinx requested him or ordered him to free it of sand and reveal it again in its true form. This was at least 1,200 years after the Sphinx is supposed to have been built 4,500 years ago. But as you know, Robert Schoch and I and many others are convinced the Sphinx is much, much older than that it goes back 12,000
Sphinx is
plus
older.
years.
And this is
The
based
head
on
is shaped
geological
different.
evidence of heavy rainfall, which
The
is
heavy
another
rainfall.
interesting thing about the
Water.
climate and the environment of that area, that we think of it as being desert, but at one point in time it wasn't.
Well, this is one of the reasons why I'm so frustrated.
Who's a
by
grifter in there?
archaeologists claiming
Because
that
I mean,
they can
that's
know
me.
there
I mean,
was no
I
lost
guess not
civilization
alternative.
when they've done
Dissonant.
so little work in the Sahara, when the Sahara was, in a number of occasions during the Ice
True.
Age, incredibly fertile, very, very nurturing environment with huge river systems running through it and lakes. It's not disputed that that was the case. It was a kind of
Graham
environment that
has
would have
amazing
nurtured human civilization.
physiognomy.
And we really
Look at this
can't
guy.
write off the possibility of a lost
What a
civilization until we
frickin'
take a much closer, much more detailed look at the Sahara. Of course, that's expensive. And then Egypt itself is in the Sahara.
Didn't they find fossilized whale bones in the Sahara?
Yeah, that would go
Green
back a
Sahara.
lot further. That would go back to millions of years, to
Oh,
a time when the oceans
never
were
mind.
different.
That's
perhaps
not
even
what we're
hundreds
talking
of
about.
millions of
So
years.
Sahara at one point in time was an ocean.
As many places were.
Wow.
Pretty much anywhere where you find limestone was once covered.
Everywhere's
by
an
The
ocean
world's changed. The world is
sometimes,
constantly
man.
changing. It's like one of those magic kids' toys where you pull a lever and it wipes out the diagram you just made. You know,
Yeah.
it just keeps on. The world keeps on recreating itself.
Just
and
keeps
we
on
human
keeping
beings
on.
make our journey through this changing
Alright,
world, and
alright,
we try to
alright.
fix it and say this is how things were, this is how things will be, and it never cooperates with us on that.
It's just incredibly fascinating that the timeline, when you go beyond the traditional timeline and you get back into where you and Robert Schoch have speculated the age of the Sphinx, now you're talking about a completely different environment of lush
Yes.
rainforest and many, many, many resources.
Absolutely, we're talking about a completely different Sahara.
This episode is brought to you by Traeger. My Traeger grill has really been a game changer when it comes to cooking up a feast.
All of the
They're
information
easy.
that Joe is using in this
Here's a cool
conversation, he
image.
learned from Graham.
And
Oh,
Sean's
yeah,
evidence
that's
is
true. He
of
totally
1,000
is.
years of heavy rainfall. That's
Mm.
what the Sphinx bears
Or
witness
Randall.
to, that it was already there.
But Graham's usually
when the
there with
rains
Randall.
of the
I
Younger
really hope they
Dryas
talk
and
about Randall.
The Younger Dryas
I hope
affected
they
the
talk about
Sahara with
this.
heavy rainfall.
I don't
Just
think
as
they
further
will.
north, it changed the climate and made
I
it much
hope they
colder. In
will.
the Sahara, it became much wetter. And it's that period of rains that are the most likely culprit for weathering the Sphinx in the way it is. But it could have stood there for thousands of years before that.
There's also very clear evidence that the face in the Sphinx is much younger, right?
No doubt about that.
Dude, he's
whatsoever.
literally,
The-
you're totally
the
right.
evidence takes
He's just repeating what Graham
Excuse me.
told him a while ago.
frog in my throat.
There's a little cough button if you want to hit that. If
Oh,
you ever want to hit it.
do I have a cough button?
Yeah, you got a little red button there.
Damn, a
That was
cough
red
button. I
button.
want a
If you
cough
feel it
button.
coming on, just
I should get one of them.
Okay.
sucker.
You have so many
I'll do
buttons.
that. Where were
Dude,
we?
I have
Um,
so many
His
buttons.
face.
You
Yeah.
guys, let me just.
The first problem is the ancient Egyptians were masters of proportion. The ancient Egyptian art is rightly world famous for its quality, and they didn't get things out of proportion. They wouldn't make that elementary error when they create this giant statue, carving it out of solid bedrock. But the head of the Sphinx is way too small in relation to the body. It looks like the head of a pin. It doesn't fit with that 270-foot long, 70-foot high body.
JC,
It
you do
looks
not like
very
Graham,
much
do you?
as though the Sphinx once had a much larger head.
Can you show us a photo of it, Jamie? It's also much less weathered, right?
And it's much less weathered. And this is again where Egyptology tries to attach the Sphinx to a particular period. Egyptology claims that's the face
You guys
of
like the video,
Khafre,
please?
who was
If
the
you haven't already, I
successor
appreciate it.
to Khufu. It doesn't look like any known statues of Khafre that I can see, but let's not worry about that.
I think some people think it looks more like a
the headdress
sub-Saharan
that's worn by the
African,
Sphinx, best looked at
with
in
the flattened
picture
nose
top
and
left
everything,
or the Quora
similar
picture.
to how they think the
That-
Olmecs,
that headdress,
which is plausible as well.
is
Well,
called
either
the
of them are
Menes
plausible,
headdress. It's a
although
classic
Egypt
headdress
is
of
more
an Egyptian
plausible.
pharaoh. Not, in my view, Khafre, but the headdress of an Egyptian pharaoh. But it's on a head that is way too small by comparison with the body. And both Shock
They
and
got
I
that
and John Anthony West,
proportion way off.
Manu Safzada, who's another
they took
excellent
it off
researcher
already.
in this field,
Jeez.
we all feel that the Sphinx was almost certainly a complete lion at one point. It was a lion with a huge mane. And that head sticking up above the plateau got very heavily eroded. And by the time the ancient Egyptians inherited it, they decided to improve it a little
Yeah.
bit, to cut down that heavily.
And they
eroded
turned it
head and
into a
put the head of
pharaoh
the
because they
pharaoh
were
on it.
god
Does it
kings.
have the
This
same
was-
sort of
well, it was
sophisticated
pre-Akhenaten. It
proportions
was
where they're
pre
perfect
the first
left and right,
monotheism,
as some
but
of the other statues do, which is another
it's the beginning of
incredible
that type of
mystery.
worship.
That when they look at the measurements of these immense statues, somehow or another they're completely symmetrical on both left and right side.
Completely symmetrical. I'm actually not sure whether that's the case with the Sphinx. But I wouldn't be surprised because
I'm
I have no
completely
doubt
symmetrical.
whatsoever that the head of the Great
perfect.
Sphinx was carved by
God
the
made me
ancient
this way.
Egyptians who made those statues. But the question is, what was it carved from? What was it cut down from?
Right.
So the geology, the precipitation-induced weathering is one of the pieces of evidence for a much older Sphinx. But the other thing is the astronomy, the fact that the Sphinx is an equinoctial marker. You know, if you
Equinoctial? I've
looking
never heard that word
due
said
east
before.
I haven't
at
either.
Giza
I'm not
or
sure what
anywhere
it
in the
means.
northern hemisphere,
Equinox
on the
relating
spring
to.
equinox.
Yep.
There's 3 key moments of the year. 4 actually. There's the winter and summer solstice, and there's the equinoxes, the spring and fall equinoxes. On the summer solstice, the
think
sun
you're better than
rises
me.
far to the north of east. On the winter solstice, it rises far to the south of east. But on the equinoxes, it aligns perfectly due east. And that's what the Sphinx is. It's aligned perfectly to due east.
Perfectly
And it's
due east.
gazing at the horizon. And then we come to this contentious issue of who
Is this-
discovered the zodiacal constellations.
This is a
Because the
diaphil?
Sphinx 12
Oh,
and a half
zodiac.
thousand years ago,
Dude, he's
was
using
gazing
words that are
at
based
dawn
in
on the
other
spring
words.
equinox at the constellation of Leo. In other words, this lion
Hmm.
monument on the ground was looking at its own celestial counterpart in the sky. Egyptologists dismissed that.
Dang,
They
you guys
say
really don't like
nobody
Graham.
had any idea of the constellations until the Greeks. I think they're wrong. So astronomy and geology together combine to invite us to consider the possibility that the Sphinx may be much older than 4,500 years old.
Maybe like
And didn't
4,580
the
or
Greeks
something.
learn from the Egyptians as well?
Not only did they learn, but they said they learned.
Yeah. So
The Greeks were very honest about it.
Yeah.
They sat at the feet of the ancient Egyptians. They said they learned
And then they
everything
took it
knew
over.
from the ancient Egyptians.
was
But
awesome.
somehow, archaeology has rewritten the narrative and gives far too much to the Greeks. Ancient Greek was a wonderful culture, magical culture.
Who was that French
beautiful,
general?
Beautiful work, but a relatively
Is he French?
recent culture.
I think it was French.
And it
Who
was
landed in
channeling
like
knowledge from much earlier times.
somewhere in the Middle
way,
East and said like,
ancient Greece
"Wake
is
up, Saladin!
Is the meeting point.
This is the
between
victory of
lost
the
ancient world
cross
and
over the
modern
crescent
world
or
in
something."
which we
He was
live.
cooler than
And
that.
that's why the Greeks and the Greek texts
I
are
don't
so
know,
useful.
no idea
to
what
us.
you're
And that's
talking
why
about. That's all
I
right.
think the Atlantis story is a very important story.
Well, it's also we do that today. If you look at the Lincoln
Frenchie, you
Monument
know what I'm talking about?
and you look at the Parthenon, I mean, we mimic ancient Greek architecture today.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, and ancient Greek architecture
And
is
what were the
awesome.
ancient Greeks copying? They were copying the
Right.
Egyptians.
It
They-
just completely makes sense.
Yeah,
that-
go to the Temple of Karnak, go to the Temple of Luxor. You're looking at the model for the later Greek temples. They followed that example and they were honest about it. It's modern archaeology that has kind of rewritten the story and given way too much to the Greeks.
When you say that in Göbekli Tepe, the
Ooh, this guy's
speculations that they use
he's
stone
shitting on the
tools,
ancients. I don't know. I don't
is
like
there
it.
any evidence of bizarre cutting like they find in Egypt where it looks like they're using some sort of a cylindrical drill, or whether it looks like the stone is somehow scooped out in some method that we don't understand?
I've not seen evidence of a cylindrical drill at Göbekli Tepe.
Apparently, yeah.
but
Henry
do see-
Gerard.
I'm going to press that
there
red
it
button.
is.
My presence here consecrates the victory
There
of
you
the
go.
cross over the crescent.
What you
Apparently,
do
maybe
see
it didn't
at
happen.
Göbekli Tepe is pillars
Oh,
with
you commented
carvings
while
in
I was trying.
relief on them.
Three-dimensional.
Three-dimensional carvings which
Oh, yeah.
stand out. That means that all of the stone around the carving had to be cut away. It wasn't a matter of incising the carving into the stone. You had to remove the stone around it and leave it standing proud.
Much more sophisticated.
And it's much more sophisticated, and it's on the oldest so far identified pillar in Göbekli Tepe, which maybe Jamie can call up. It's pillar 43 in enclosure D at Göbekli Tepe, which is, any chance of getting that up? It's a remarkable piece of ancient art. It's definitely 11,600 years old. So often, the Tepe telegrams, for example, will show it. That's on the right there, another wonderful piece of relief carving. But there, pillar 43, this vulture is in exactly the position of the constellation of Sagittarius. And the disc over its wing suggests
Well, that's
the
pretty
sun
cool.
against the background of the constellation of
I
Sagittarius.
got to block it a little bit
Below
because
it,
they'll
we
get
have a
mad at me.
scorpion,
But it's
so like
got
the
the
constellation
whole.
of Scorpio, and roughly in the right place. Above it, we have a serpent descending, a bit like Ophiuchus.
Wow.
It seems to speak to a knowledge of astronomy at an ancient time. Again, it's controversial, but a lot of work has been done on
course
this. But
it's
the point is, the
controversial.
carving of that is highly sophisticated at 11,600 years old.
Yeah.
That creature,
It's
whatever it is,
probably
Jamie, that one that's sort of black
actually
and
not
white,
that. It's probably
image, in
less
the center
sophisticated
says
than it was
Visual
before.
Arts Cork. Yeah, click on that one. That one's amazing.
It's amazing. They cut away the whole pillar to leave that creature there, which itself is hard to identify. Is it a crocodile? We found something very similar in
No,
in
it's not a
Peru, as matter
crocodile.
of fact.
I think that's
Well,
pretty
the
easy. to answer.
proportions are off.
I'm gonna
A
go with
crocodile
no.
Looks more like a cat.
Yeah, I think it looks more like some kind of feline, but exactly what
Yeah, I don't know.
creature it
It
is.
looks like a
Something with
freaking
tail.
yeah, it's hard
possum to me.
identify.
It
When
doesn't,
you
but
know,
Possum. We're
this
going
is all
possum.
so
we're going
interesting
possum.
to me.
Oh,
And
possum.
when
North American style.
these people are trying to date this to 11,800 years ago and say that people only had stone tools, how do they speculate that these people did this stuff?
You can,
Dude, they
do stuff
don't
with
have
stone.
good
So they
explanations.
use
That's
harder
the thing.
stone.
They don't think
carve
they
this
have to.
stone,
That's the argument.
and is there evidence of
It's a
these
terrible
stones?
argument.
No, not that
You
I'm
can't
aware
get that
of.
level of precision.
There are some so-called pounding stones,
Mm.
but I find it difficult to see how pounding away could have.
I also like
created this
Graham.
Very
Thanks,
fine
Jay Forte.
result.
Mm.
It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. It's the same with the incredible work that you find at Cuzco and Sacsayhuaman in Peru. Again, they're not supposed to have had, this is supposedly recent, I think it's much older, the Incas, not supposed to have had metal tools. They're supposed to have done all the work with stone tools. I think it's a reach. I think we're looking at a technology we don't understand.
So
Yeah,
one of them
it's
looks like a
probably
wild
something
boar, the
that's
one to
just
the left
different.
looks
It's
like
not better or
definitely
worse.
a
It's
wild boar.
different.
wild boar. Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
People don't
So that's
understand the level of
identifiable,
like
which is interesting when you look at the other ones that
like
aren't
this
that
isn't the only
identifiable.
path that was
Yeah,
possible.
yeah.
We
Some
could
of
have
them
taken
are
a different path.
identifiable.
Yeah, I don't know what's that.
Culture.
What's that one supposed to be?
That's a fox.
A fox.
Everything's built on things in
interestingly,
the
coming
past,
out of it
so
are
these old things.
streamers.
Mhm.
And my colleague
persistent.
Martin Sweatman from the University of Edinburgh has suggested
I went to
that
the
is,
University of Edinburgh
representing
a few weeks.
meteors
Summer
coming
class.
down from the sky. Those
What-
streamers out of the tail of the fox, and the fox was a constellation.
What's that little fellow right there, Jamie? It says in Turkey, right to the left of your cursor. Yeah, right there. What's that?
A human form.
Is that another one
Ooh,
from somewhere else?
What does that look
No,
like? That looks
no,
like a
that's-
tiki guy
that's-
to me. You
I'm
see
not sure
that?
which
like
site that
Groot.
is from. It could be from
I am
Göbekli
Groot.
Tepe, judging by the feline figures beside it. Let's find out.
Mm.
Gorgeous.
Ad Broker.
Oh, you got us. You got to
See.
subscribe.
Yeah.
Oh, is the ad blocker?
Too complicated.
Is it letting you go back? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, how do they? We
Okay.
have those images.
We're more
from
positive on
ancient
Graham now. I
Sumer,
appreciate that,
which are
boys.
6,000
And possibly
years old or so,
girls and
that
women.
show what appears to be the solar system. So how do they?
Well, first of all, let's remember ancient Sumer was in Mesopotamia.
Yes.
And Mesopotamia is a Greek word, means between the rivers. And the rivers referred to are the Tigris and the Euphrates.
Tigris and Euphrates.
And where is Göbekli
Remember those
Tepe?
from secondary
Right
school,
between the
boys?
headwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers.
Here it is. Hard to grasp relief of man holding his phallus found in Turkey.
Which site? Sanliurfa is the big city nearby. That's where you need to go if you want to go to Göbekli Tepe. Not saying which site it was.
Can I see that image again?
It could be Karahan Tepe, where I've been, but I haven't seen that figure. That's
It looks like he's covering his phallus, like he's embarrassed.
No,
Or
he's
maybe
holding it.
pregnant.
yeah.
Look, maybe it's the first pregnant man.
We don't know. We don't know. We don't know what it means.
I don't want to.
But he's definitely holding his dick.
It
that's
seems
for
like
sure.
it. Seems like
Can't hear you
maybe he's
anymore.
peeing.
No.
You can't hear me?
What is he doing?
That's good because
What
I
is he doing?
exhaled right into the
I
mic.
don't know, and we don't know.
He was holding his
The-
dick, definitely.
The problem is no written texts have come down to us from that time. So
Right.
everything in a sense is speculation. What isn't speculation is the dating. I have grave doubts about carbon dating in many cases because carbon dating doesn't date stone. It dates organic materials. So the notion that you can date a megalithic site with carbon dating is questionable right away. But what tends to be done is that you
can date
look for a
objects
piece
found
of
there.
organic material that is so associated with the megalith you want to date that you can say or propose
still
that
don't
they
know,
come
though.
from the same period of time.
Especially because even if
I have
it
that
is from
problem
the
with huge
construction
Moai
of the
statues in
megalith,
Easter
like
Island.
these things were
They're
created
not
and
carbon
repaired
dated.
and
What's carbon
phases
dated is
and-
the platforms they stand
You don't
on.
know.
And there's a lot to suggest that those platforms
It's
are
all
much later
guesswork,
than
man.
the
That's why it's not
original
science.
statues, and the
It's
statues were
humanities. It's great. I love
re-erected on
anthropology,
those-
but
on-
it's
on
not
those
science.
platforms. In the case of Göbekli Tepe, one of the very special things about it is that it was deliberately buried. They ran that site for about 1,000 years, from 11,600 to say 10,600 years ago, and then they closed it down. And they went to great effort to fill up all the enclosures with rubble and to create a hill over the top of it.
It's a
And
modern
that's why
landfill, dude. That's
Göbekli
wild.
Tepe then remained untouched for the next 10,000 years. There's no danger of contamination
So we
with
got
younger
here.
carbon from a later culture.
Hmm.
The fact that they found carbon in enclosure 40 in enclosure D right by pillar 43 dated to 11,600 years ago does firmly connect that place to 11,600 years ago. There are later dates from Göbekli Tepe. It wasn't all built in one go, but it stopped around 1,000 or maybe 1,200 years after it started, as though they'd achieved what they wanted to achieve. The population had all become agriculturalists. We move on into the Holocene, into the modern age. And it's that moment of transition following an enormous cataclysm that really fascinates me.
So, if they attribute the constellations to ancient Greece, what do they say about the clay tablets from Sumer?
I've not seen any archaeologist who attributes knowledge of the constellations to the ancient Sumerians.
if
That's
we
a bit
can
too late. The
pull that image
Babylonians,
up.
maybe.
Pull that image up, because this image has always been wild to me,
Let's have a look.
because it kind of shows a sun in the center, and then it shows all of the
Let's
planets in
see.
our solar system
Oh,
in
gosh. I don't even know
relatively
if I've
the
heard of
correct
this.
sizes.
Mhm.
Relatively,
I wouldn't be surprised by that.
in terms of what's the bigger one, what's the smaller one.
I think the ancients had, or certain peoples amongst the ancients did have a very good idea
Has
about
multicam
our
set
solar
up.
system and about the dimensions of the Earth and about the other planets in our solar system. Again, this is something that archaeology has dismissed, but I think it's a possibility that's worthy of inquiry.
No, it's not that one.
Just waiting
That's a
for him
different
to
one.
find
It's
the right image and pull it
yeah,
up.
That's it.
There we
That's
go.
it.
There
it
we
is.
go.
So
A
there's
sun-
the sun, and it's surrounded by the planets that we're aware of.
Yeah, it's
What?
kind of hard to interpret that any other way, isn't it?
What?
I mean,
I don't.
It seems like
I-
that's what it is.
What are
It
you
seems like
talking
the solar
about?
system.
Yes.
I mean,
There's all I
even
see
the
is
way
three
the
dudes.
sun is depicted is the way a little kid depicts the
Yeah,
sun.
yeah, yeah. And it's also
Oh.
depicted as a star as well as the sun, the circle
Yes.
disk of the sun, and the sun is a star. So
It's
the
such a strange
the
image.
suggestion is much greater knowledge of the universe than is supposed to have existed at that time. And this is Sumer. Sumer is supposedly the first civilization, the oldest civilization on Earth.
Yeah.
Goes back about 6,000 years. But then what about the prequels to Sumer? And let's
The
take Göbekli
oldest
Tepe into account
civilization in the
because it's
world
so
is
close
the
to Sumer.
Irish.
Mhm.
And by the way, just within a few hundred kilometers of Göbekli Tepe is Abu Huraira,
I don't know why I said
where
that.
there is compelling evidence
definitely
of
not
a
true.
massive airburst 12,800 years ago and a complete wipeout of the local population. I don't think it's an accident that Göbekli Tepe is where it is.
Is there images of this explosion in the sky?
There's an artist's impression of the explosion in the sky.
Right, but do they have evidence
Ancient
on the
images?
ground, like you can
Like
see
an
like
artist's
impression?
Tunguska,
Yes.
where it's all flattened?
Yes, ancient,
Dinosaurs.
massive amount of evidence on the ground, particularly what is called shocked quartz, where the quartz has been melted at temperatures in excess of 2,000 degrees centigrade.
Wow.
This is not caused by village fires.
That's crazy,
this is
dude.
the characteristic fingerprint of a cosmic impact.
Cosmic Impact
Platinum,
2000. It
iridium,
couldn't be like
Carbon microspherules.
lava
All of these
or a
impact proxies.
probably a
are
lot, but,
found
like,
in
it could be a-
abundance at Abu Huraira.
Is there a clear
thunder
area
lightning
that's similar
strike
to what
goes
looks like in
up to
Tunguska,
2,000
The
where
degrees
problem with
Celsius?
Abu Huraira is that it's now
Yeah, I would have to.
underwater.
Probably not very
Aswan
big of an
Dam
area, though.
flooded it.
Why do people say
But
centigrade
before
and
it was
Celsius? That's the same
submerged,
thing, right?
An enormous amount of material. was
Centigrade
taken from
just
it, and
sounds
it's
aggressive with that
soil
R there.
that
I
was
like
taken from
Celsius.
Abu
It's a
Huraira
very
to preserve it,
soft
which is
word to say.
producing the evidence
Celsius.
of a younger Dryas
Lots of
impact there,
sawas,
12,800 years ago.
C's and S's.
So when was this dam?
Celsius.
When did this take place?
60s, something
Oh,
like that.
No.
Something like that. I think Abu Huraira has been underwater since the 60s or certainly the 70s,
Oh,
maybe
yeah.
the 70s.
Jeez.
What a bummer.
What a bummer. But in this case, thank you archaeology for preserving
Yeah.
soil and materials from that site,
Mm.
which allow this
Appreciate that,
work
boys.
to be done. There's no doubt that a cataclysmic event took place there. There's just a whole bunch of new papers published in the last 2 or 3 weeks on Abu Huraira, which are further consolidating this evidence that it was subject to a very large airburst,
Mm.
and that after that, within the
A very large
1,000 to
airburst. Is
2,000 years
this?
after that, just as at Göbekli Tepe,
Is he still talking about something
the local
solar?
population transitioned from hunter gathering to agriculture.
Yes.
It's fascinating.
large
to me
airburst?
how when you
Apparently,
go
this
to
like if
these
this happened
sites
today,
see
and it like
these,
likely will, it would be like an
where these ancient
EMT
structures
or
existed,
EMP, and it would just wipe
imagine the
out our
climate
electronics.
Well, it
and
did
what a
happen.
major
There was the one
factor that
airburst
plays
over
in
Russia.
what human beings
Oh.
do,
Yeah.
and what they're able to do, whether
That
they're
one
able to
leveled
thrive
ridiculous
because there's
amount. I don't
Right,
know
right,
that.
right.
resources,
Tunguska
and
or
then it
whatever.
seems like those are the
Tunguska.
places
They were talking about
where they create these incredible structures, like
Yeah.
the Mayans.
Yeah.
And where you go to a place like North America.
Oh, well, that's a real
20,000 years
answer.
ago, was
Thanks.
Unbelievably inhospitable.
Thanks, Frenchie.
Terrifying and filled with all sorts of predators,
Massive predators.
much like
Oh,
parts of Africa.
centigrade.
Right? I mean, we had a North American lion, which is
Centigrade.
bigger than the African
Centigrade.
lion, the North American cheetah.
It's a grade of
There's
100.
all sorts of the
It's an
short
ingredient of
faced
100,
bear, there's
obviously.
saber-toothed
Okay.
tigers.
Yeah, all
Me-
sorts of animals that would make
makes
it
sense.
really difficult
You
to
don't
like
wanna-
thrive.
You don't want to
Yeah,
meet one of
saber-tooth
those.
tigers.
No. So it makes sense that the people that lived there didn't have the sort of technological sophistication
Yeah.
that maybe people had in the where
The
Giza
northern
was.
part of North America is certainly the area that was under the ice cap until 11,000 years ago. Waste of time looking for any sign of a lost civilization there. Northern Europe, waste of time.
They don't even
Because it
look.
was
That's the
also a
thing. They
frozen
don't look.
wasteland,
And if they don't look, they can't find anything.
Areas
If they don't dig
equator,
deep enough
once
in
you
the
get down
ground,
into the southern
'cause that-
states.
Okay,
of
I need to
America,
say this
North
because
America,
I've said this on my
get yourself
podcast. I don't know if you guys have listened to all of it, but the freaking like in archaeology, when you're digging, like each dig is a whole thing. It's not even just one archaeologist that has a PhD. It's an archaeologist. It's other people working with them. It's like there's master students. There's usually a bunch of people, and it's like you can't. It takes like it can take hours to go down 10 centimeters. And you would have to go down meters into the ground a lot of the times to find stuff that's like 20,000 years old. Nobody does it. They literally just don't do it. So you would have to find this stuff by absolute chance, because they'll find a sterile layer. And once you find a sterile layer, you don't go down anymore. And when I say sterile, I mean when you find a layer that has no human artifacts in it, no human anything in it, you're not going to keep going and going and going because it just takes too long. And if you do that, there might be a sterile layer if there was something like an ice age somewhere. And then, so yeah, there could be, I don't know why there would be, but there definitely could be just a massive human civilization, or not even massive, but just like more significant. Because even today, it's not very populated up in northern Canada, and northern Alaska, but there could be stuff up there. We don't know because the climate's changed so much. That could have been at a different time. It might have been more hospitable, but like they're not even digging there, much less going down low enough to be able to find something that's old enough.
Get yourself into Mexico. Get yourself to the Yucatan, the Maya culture. Then you're looking at a place where civilizations could really grow and flourish.
I mean, it's a good excuse,
really
JC, because it really is a lot of time.
the-
But
just the
yeah,
history of North America in
it's
general,
unfortunate that they
is
do this,
that,
especially because then they
you know,
stop
when
other
you
research
look
and
at
everything.
how the Native Americans existed and the way they lived, just a few hundred years ago. That seems to be like an artifact of what life was like before that.
Yes.
Artifact means
I think
physical,
we
but
must
that's
give
fine.
full credit to hunter-gatherer civilizations who might do a bit of agriculture on the side. These are the masters of survival on our planet,
Right.
not us.
They were the
Well,
ones who kept the species alive.
They were the ones after the Younger Dryas who kept the species alive, in
talks about this a
my
lot.
view, because they knew how to survive. And
The hunter-gatherers knew how to survive.
I've made this point before, but
Oh,
if such a cataclysm were to occur to our civilization today, and I don't think it would take much
They
to
do,
bring our
JC.
civilization down.
They do.
Full-scale
And that makes
nuclear
sense.
war,
It's different
end of the
interests.
story for technological civilization.
There's likely a lot of
21st
incredible
century.
stuff in Southeast Asia, and it's
Another
completely
comet impact,
neglected.
something like the Younger Dryas happening.
It's likely
again.
another lost civilization.
Sudden sea level rises. Consider how
when,
many cities we have built along
greater
coastlines.
area
30-foot
of
sea level rise
Majapahit
would destroy them.
was
And
much larger.
the psychological nature
Well,
of
when
our
there was more land,
civilization
when
is
the
very entitled.
sea levels were
We
lower.
tend to feel we've got it all made. We take it all for granted. We're not equipped to think about disaster descending upon us. So if such a thing were to occur, and God forbid that it does, those survivors from our industrialized technological society, those who made it through, would be smart to go take refuge amongst hunter-gatherers. They would be the ones who would preserve them and allow them to continue forwards. And maybe
Frenchie,
in
what are
that
you talking about
process,
here?
there
That
would be
sounds
an
amazing.
exchange of information, just as
I haven't heard of this, though.
survivors of industrial civilization would learn from hunter-gatherers. So also they might have something to teach to hunter-gatherers. And I think that's what happened 12,800 years ago.
Well, it seems like there's so much compelling evidence that that's the case. I
Okay,
get so
we're gonna cut it off here,
puzzled and
boys. I'm
baffled
gonna do
by
the other
this
half later. I would have done
because
more,
it's
but
just interesting.
didn't
if
plan
it's
ahead
right,
quite as well. We
it
had some
pulls the
tech
rug out
troubles.
completely
So
from
I
under the feet
will
of
be back
archaeology.
later.
And
Thanks for
that's why
joining
there's
us.
resistance.
I
All
will,
human beings
when
are
I'm back home, I'll do
territorial
longer
in their own
streams. I
way.
like doing the long
And
ones when people
archaeologists
pop
are no
in. But
exception. They're territorial.
if you
They
want to
define their
keep
territory.
watching this, I
They
will
s-
restart this later. But if you want to keep watching this on your own, we're at 1 hour, 21 minutes, 35 seconds. All right, later, guys. Thanks for joining.